Thank you, Monica, for this nice introduction, and so, and also thank you all for staying here to last the keynote today. And that's always an advantage when you are the speaker, and a disadvantage. The advantage that you know all the topics that have been discussed during the day, and the disadvantage that the audience has a problem that we call massive information overload, so that they have that they are featuring through all this day of the day. And I think that I try to be quite brief a little bit and to present a little bit our work, or my work and the work of my research group that is called DCAT group, Dynamics, Interaction, Communication and Activity. So we have different, we're analyzing different topics, but one of the topics that we want to explain a little bit more today is social media. We just finished a major European project over 3 years with 14 private and public partners on social media and language learning. We have another project that will start next month about leadership 2.0. If corporate cultures are changing when digital natives come into managerial positions, and if they experience the possibility to change this culture. That is also quite an interesting project that starts. And another one, as we did desktop research, and we found out that only 10% of the European research projects use social media, for example, for promoting their ideas and their research, so that we also are focusing on the other projects, the European project also in this area, to convince project managers, project leaders to use much more social media for promoting their ideas and to create a community of, I would say, practice or community of interest around their project. So what we're doing today is to speak a little bit about social cultural views on learning and development. That's a little bit the approach that we have on What's the Learner 2.0, interactions through Web 2.0 tools, and then more a bit about what is higher education as seen from an activity point of view, the activity context, higher education activity context, and then are there possible pathways to change the practice and the culture of higher education. So, I just want to start about a little bit about development, as we think that development is quite very important in our work. Every time, and I think that we heard it also today, when we speak about new technologies, it's also about development of literacy skills, development of IT skills, development of identities. So there's a lot of development around this field, and so that's why we think that learning and development are quite important things in this area. So there are different approaches to conceive and to conceptualize development. So you see biological maturation or more environmental learning, or how do both interact, as for example in constructivist approaches. All these three approaches might be very useful. Some of you might work in this area. We recognize another approach that we would say more a context-sensitive approach, a contextual approach. We say that this environmental features and biological maturation get shaped in a specific context of a historically grown practice, historical grown form of culture. That can be culture of a community, can be culture of a country, can be culture also of an organization. And that's quite interesting, as all the time we focus it on an active engagement of a person with the world, and also how the activities and these patterns in a certain context get shaped and change over time, and maybe also influence the actions of the persons that are living in this context. And as we heard it also today, I think when we have this specific focus on this activity-based and this cultural-based development and learning approaches, this fits quite well for all the processes that deal with new technologies or social media. So when we speak about culture, we think that we, for example, this is a definition that fits well into our approach, that culture consists of human designs for living that are based on the accumulated knowledge of a people, encoded in their language, which is quite very important, the language, and embodied in the physical artifacts, beliefs, values, customs, and activities that have been passed down from one generation to the next. And then when we speak about technologies, when we speak about IT, then our focus is on culture, how it is embodied in the tools. Because the tools are created and developed with the activity over time, and they carry also kind of cultural heritage with them that, of course, will influence our way of thinking, our way of acting when we use them. And that's quite easy when you just have a look at the IT tools from the print press from Gutenberg to I think these kind of technologies that we have in our pockets today, and that are more computers than phones today. So, but the other interesting thing is when these tools are used and the culture that is related to them, then we have kind of interactions with an accumulation and the transmission of social knowledge that has been inbuilt in these tools, and as they are never, I would say, static, all the time in a quite dynamic change, quite dynamic development. It's very interesting to work in this area and to see how this culture is changing, and what we see a more dialectical approach, how the culture is changing, the tools are changing, and also the human actions that are within this context are changing and developing new ways of dealing with problems. So when we frame activity, that's always that we see who are the subjects, what is the object of a certain activity, and then we try to analyze it according to the tools that the people use in this specific context for solving a problem, for dealing with an issue. On the one hand, so these technical tools or platforms, or however you want to call them. On the other hand, of course, the humans that are social actors within this context. So all the communities that are involved, and most of the time the users are more are part of or member of more than one community. So, and then we see interesting interactions between the tools and between the people that are in a certain context, in a certain community, and we call this multimodal interactions. What is our most analyzed topic in the research group? So dynamics in this interaction, this multimodal interaction, is our major research topic. So we can focus on contextual practices of different professional communities, of different everyday communities, or so on. That might be at school, that might be other things. So at the end, there's an outcome coming out of this activity that might be analyzed. On the other hand, also when we look at the context and when we look at the activity, it's not so much the outcome, but also the process, how this outcome or a certain object is transformed in an outcome, and where the problems are, and where we might see some changes. So when we speak about human practices, we always see them as distributed amongst people, semiotic and tool mediators, time, space were quite important, the physical environment, and we never limit our unit of analysis only to individual traits, to functions, to mechanisms, processes, and properties of a single user. But we see them more as human practices that are at the core of any psychological process at all. So either it's persons acting with mediational means, or with ICT means, or with social media means, or individuals that are engaged and that are organized in culturally shaped forms of human activity. So when we look a little bit at the talk today, what is the learner, so the individual on the one hand, and the interactions on the other hand, and the context on the third, are always the three features that we focus in our research, and we never focus on one dimension only, but always on these three elements in interrelation. Even when we put the emphasis sometimes on the learner, sometimes on the interaction, sometimes on the context, but we always see these three things in a highly interrelated mode. When we focus a little bit on the learner, we have to say that in this times of growth of social media, proliferation of social media and IT, Web2 technologies, there is an enormous increase of informal learning. We see it through the where the topics such as serendipity, tangential learning, incidental learning, and so on, of informal learning. So, but it's interesting that we see here what I would call blurring spheres, because on the one hand, these tools have been developed not for learning in the first idea, but much more for leisure activities. And we see that through these activities that people run and deploy, they do a lot of there are a lot of informal learning and informal learning in place. So the interesting question is when we would use this technologies more for learning in formal settings, if we do not, if we are allowed to do this in this sense, if we at the end do not risk to lose what's a highly specificity. The specificity is of this technological tools when they are used for in a more informal way in everyday settings. So when we speak about learning, so there are different approaches, and I think also the first keynote speaker of this morning spoke a lot about learning. So on the one hand, we have learning as acquisition, as we see something that's kind of knowledge that has been developed over time, and that is in a certain way transmitted to people that are attending an institutional or instructional setting. On the other hand, through this social media and also to all this kind of collaborative tools, we have another approach that we call learning as participation. And both as well, the learning as acquisition on the one hand and learning as participation on the other hand, form an interesting context for already organizing instructional or academic programs. But we think that it's not enough because there's another approach, or I would say a third metaphor, that we could say that learning through expansion or learning as knowledge creation. We would say that social cultural perspectives emphasize a more dialectical view that goes beyond the learning and acquisition only or being part of a learning community on the other hand, but really to go beyond this move from an incompetent to competent, from a novice to an expert member, but really to focus also on the transformation of the learning culture itself. And that's something that is quite interesting also, as we heard this morning, that there's really a tremendous stability in this academic networks, in this academic context, still to highlight and to promote the form of a lecture. I would say the first tool, the first practice to transmit something or to involve people in a certain context. So it might be transmission or it might be participation, but anyway, most of the time the lecture is a traditional form of instruction in higher education, especially. So the question could be: is higher education a ritual performance, as it has been emphasized in the work of Lev Sanger, who is situated learning? They have this apprenticeship, this cognitive apprenticeship model, where in the middle of the community we have the expert, the master, and the novice is coming from the periphery, so the peripheral legitimate participation. He's moving to the center, and then he gets his master status and he can get off. But this is also for my way a very rigid way of a model of participation, of acquisition that is really rigid. So there's no dynamic in this model, as there's only one move, only from the periphery to the center. So we also try to stress and to emphasize that learning should be designed in and for changing work practices, and that the community itself should be, I would say, extended through by a transformative space, where we'd say in the transformative space the culture is also a subject of inquiry, and so in this transformative space there are a lot of patterns of activity that are critically stored and critically reshaped during the process itself. So that it's not just only a move from the center, from the periphery to the center, but that the entire community is under permanent inquiry. And of course, there are a lot of boundary space that we just saw a lot of informal learning tools are available. People have certain practices at home of learning, of participating. So they bring these practices to the academic context or to the higher education context. And so this is an interesting thing that we have an overlap. And when we look a little bit only at this part, so that we see that there are higher education or university practices of transmission, of participation, of learning, of instruction as well. And on the other hand, we have the students and maybe also the teachers or the academic staff to learn of diverse home practices that might be brought into an overlap. And these boundary crossing practices are quite interesting, especially when we focus on this Web 2.0 tools. These Web 2.0 tools are really, I would say, one of the interesting features of learning in everyday context today. So when we just have a look at what's possible, only one example among so many, only that on a picture sharing platform as Flickr, you have today in an open mode a lot of interesting art conversations, and you can really go to the site and look what kind of interesting discussions people do in an open mode, in an open platform around a painting or around another artwork, and it's really tremendous what you can learn going just to the site and looking what others have already said about the painting, for example. So there's a lot of informal learning possibilities, and also I would say that the platform itself is attracting all kinds of people, experts and novices, and maybe art people, just to exchange their ideas and to have a certain community. An interesting study has also been done by the Humboldt-based, in Berlin, Humboldt-based research group about Internet und Gesellschaft, also Forschungsgruppe für Internet und Gesellschaft, based Humboldt University, and they did, because there are never really data available, what are these digital natives doing? And they simply did a research on their students and followed them from the morning to the night. They were doing an entire day and see what they are doing. Even during the night, apparently, they really recorded what was done. And there at 8:15, that's a really a nice time when these guys got up. So they are already awakened by a digital divide. And you see that when we just take the case of this guy who's called Florence, that in a day is 120 minutes online. He's looking TV for 100 minutes. He's listening to radio to 90, 70 minutes. He's sending 10 SMS, and he is on the phone for 1 hour during the day. You see a little bit what they are doing and also what kind of tools they use while they are, for example, in a meeting in their I don't know how to say, in the Wohngemeinschaft, or in their house where they meet with other guys, or how the evening looks like. It was just to have different cases and to have different examples how the tools are shaping the day activities of different people. And I found it quite interesting, as at least we have a little bit more reliable data, even when, of course, it's only the case and the student that they selected, and maybe they also agreed to get recorded over an entire day. So when we move a little bit to the interaction part of the talk, so I would just to start with where we head on, because when now we do research, it's no longer so much on Web 2.0, and there's also the second keynote speaker today was presenting quite brilliantly that our research goes to the Web 3.0, all this data mining, the semantic web technologies. So really to see to build a web where the context where the context of content is defined by the data, and we know how important these data are or have become. And in all the research, everyone is only speaking. We have to really to try to compile, collect data for making or for developing applications that can make use of this kind of data. So a web capable of reading and understanding content and context. So that's really, as you say, it gets really personal. The web will get really personal. But of course, it was never, it wasn't the case when it started. The Web 2.0 was mainly a network of hyperlinks, and the content was local, and you had just to follow these hyperlinks to find it. So what really changed with the Web 2.0, because Web 2.0, everyone could produce content, and this content is distributed across a network of different platforms, of different sites, of different web pages, and the data is shared is shared by the people through this network. When we have a look at this Web 2.0, we would say that it's a technological platform that is really based on the internet, all the computers, and it's running on internet-based computers, and it's enabling what we call today social media or the social web. And we use Henlein and Kaplan and Henlein's definition of it. What is a social web? What is social media? A group of internet-based applications that build on the ideological and technological foundations of Web 2.0, and that allows the creation and exchange of user-generated content. So when social media is a lot, as Web 2.0, it's a lot about participation, and so social media is a set of a range of heterogeneous applications that are fundamentally different from all the ICT tools that we had on the age of Web 1.0. They create a global participatory medium. And for example, we see here that you can divide these apps in different categories. But as soon as one of the researchers is doing that, of course, through the dynamics in the field, new categories will appear. And you just see a lot of things that for our research are quite interesting as we focus on these multi-modal interactions, and you see that here we have a very broad range of different modalities, how people can express themselves and can share content via the web, so media sharing, media manipulation, online gaming that we just had in the presentation just before this talk, blogging, social bookmarking, and all these kind of things. I like, for example, this kind of representation, how the different possibilities are presented that people can use for sharing and generating content. And of course, I think that's only the 2010 representation, because they make an update every year. And for the moment, I think it has so many petals that it's not even really presentable any longer, because all the time when there's an overlap, new developments take place, and new developments take place, and so you see a lot of new applications, new platforms appear. But what I find interesting in this representation of Web 2.0 tools, that they call it the conversation, because it is always a conversation between guys who create content and others who can react. This I wouldn't call it collaborative work, but this was an interactive work. It's really an interesting feature of this Web 2.0 technologies, and also a kind of tremendous medium for all kind of new and novel improvements and novel platforms that appear. Yeah. So generating content could as well be introduced in higher education. So we'll show you afterwards one or two examples what we did with this kind of technology. But for example, only the social networking and virtual collaboration means that we can enhance the interaction between the guys that are involved in a certain community, that have a certain interest in a community. When we speak about this feed, this automatic feeding of information to a person who is interested in it, that means about sharing, discovering, and tapping into reflections very often, because we think of that this Web 2.0 tools can be used for reflecting on the practices that are, for example, implemented in a higher education context or in academic context. Wikis and tags connecting and remixing reflections about academic topics, about learning topics, about content topics, or reflection in and on action, of course, when we create this, when we say that Web 2.0 is about collaboration, it's about user-generated content, the learners themselves can create via these microblogs or via these blogging elements content that can be part of a course. So that is a really an interesting set of tools that can use for opening the content, for opening, let's say, the context of academic courses. When we have a look a little bit what the users do, we had already this first element where we just followed a little bit the day of a student. I start just with data that we get from Luxembourg. We don't have a lot of, and I put the ones that are the most interesting. So guys who are online on the social media for more than 1 hour a day, and I found something interesting that the higher up here. The lower is the percentage of these guys who stay as long on a social media platform. I have no idea how reliable these data are because they are from the National Statistical Agency of Luxembourg. But this is interesting. If there is any relation on the education of these guys who are doing things in this on the social media. But we see that, of course, with the age, and that's something that we participation is decreased. When we look at what people do, of course, they try to stay in contact with people that they knew before, or that they have locked out of sight, and so on. And here, it's less different levels of education, for example. And also, what's quite interesting that even a lot of people that even use the social media at a later stage in their life to stay connected with people they had maybe the chance to know during their life. When you look at this German data, it's a little bit the same. This data you see also that different platforms see that women and men here are nearby at the same rate, but exactly again the same for the different categories of age. That the youngsters under 20, of course, are the most active on these platforms, and then it decreases until people that are older than 60. I also had a look at the Australian agency of Nielsen, who is editing every year a social media report, and it's interesting that they see that they at least they document that the use of social media is an increase. You see that the blue is for the 2012 data, and the black one is about the 2011 data. That there's more, use of social media anyway. And what's interesting here, you will see another that people access this social media more and more by mobile devices. That's, for example, here, this is why you have during the year 2012, that, for example, that this mobile devices get really the, let's say, the tool for having access to the social media. But on the other hand, when we ask ourselves the questions, what do people do, and where do they have access, where do they access the social media platforms during the day? It might be in the traffic jam, it might be in the bus. That's really something that is going with the people over the day. Why we connect, or why they connect, that a little bit the same things that we just saw also in the Luxembourgish data, to stay in contact with people that they knew during their lives. They are interested in creating some connections, and to stay in friends, together with friends, even online. Very often, this online connections are just strengthening the offline connections with their friends. How they connect, and you really see again that this social, that this mobile device access via fixed and fixed PCs, fixed computers is slight decrease. That might even get more important during the next years. The last thing that was really a little bit also funny thing that you find in this kind of report, where do they connect? It's interesting that connect in the bathroom to this social media thing. So immediately I was thinking about maybe when we speak about smart surfaces, so there might be an entire range of development just for the door of a bathroom. They can be already interactive so that the guys do not have to take their device out in the thing. So, of course, just as a wrap to that, it's no longer just about sharing the content, but really trying to build around this, to sharing the content through the platforms, but the content will find the user across different platforms. What about higher education as an activity context? I guess one that was mentioned also by Marcel Lebrun this morning, that the Bologna reform puts emphasis on these learning outcomes. And today, that was interesting because it was just at the same moment that the new century started, that we have these 21st century outcomes, and they are quite highly promoted for the moment. But what's interesting is that we have at the center at least these 4 C's, a lot about critical thinking, about communication, about collaboration, about creativity. And I think that, for example, just these 4 elements are extremely highly promoted also to all this kind of social media stuff that is available. The green one is the topics, we could say the topic of the academic topics, academic disciplines, the core subjects that we either teach in a secondary school or in a higher education context. What's interesting as well are these life and career skills, and on the other hand, really the technology skills that on the very right of this graph. And I find this an interesting approach that we should maybe think more about this different of this entire range of 21st century skills when we design academic learning experiences. So this is the classical classification by Bloom that has little been further been developed by we experienced this, and we use this classification, for example, for conceiving learning outcomes in a master's program here at university. And why I put the blue ones, someone in this dark blue is, I think that they are extremely interesting because again we have this creating, we have this element of analyzing or synthesizing something or evaluating something. That is really what we could say. There is a lot of potential for Web 2.0 technology for promoting all of this kind of skills or for developing this kind of skills in academic context. You see a little bit here also what is asked by the different nice when, as we did, really to see if you can, in an academic course, go beyond just remembering something or applying something, but really put into elements that will say, not the creative part, because this is quite complex, and even when the guys want to create something, we have to remember other elements as well. So when the higher you get, I wouldn't say that one are lower and the other are higher, but at least when it's about creation, when it's about evaluation or analysis, there are a lot of other dimensions that are involved, and this is kind of, I think, also kind of really learner-centered and absolutely learner-centered approach to higher education, and also a lot of agency for the guys that are involved. We experienced a little bit, for example, with similar platforms where the students had to upload videos for presentations, and others could comment it on their performance, on the topics, and on their arguments. That was extremely well perceived. And it allows also guys who cannot attend an event or cannot attend a certain course that they might participate, or they might later on write some comments on what happened. So Of course, you have always these private video spaces. Otherwise, you risk violate privacy and presentability. The other topic that was also already mentioned this morning by the first speaker, by Professor Leblanc, is this massively open online courses that really get very prominent for the moment. And when we just look at, for example, this open course network or the open course consortium that has for the moment about 250 or 280 higher education institutions all over the world, but also interesting where they are located. No? There are only 50 in Europe for the moment. I know it because we just submitted a European project to develop this open courseware in the area of science, technology, and engineering. It's quite interesting that this is a sector that is really in growth for the moment. But also, on the other hand, we see that political policies, European policies, are also taking this into account. And as, for example, the 2012 strategy in education by the European Commission is emphasizing that we have to rethink the education strategy. Of course, they notice that Europe is a little bit left behind in this development, its evolution, and investing in new skills for better socio-economic outcomes. And for example, this open education is also now one of the 6 strategy lines that they have announced and that they have promoted in November. But what is even more interesting, that's what I found last week or 2 weeks ago on the blog Forward. So it is changing something. And this guy is asking or raising an interesting question, because he says, so long it was only about credentials when white people went to universities. But if we have a system where we really could evaluate and assess what is done in these massive open online courses, so there might be a major change coming up in the academic landscape. And so he's mentioning the state of Wisconsin, of the University of Wisconsin, who is now saying that the officials encourage their students to complete their education independently from the university through online courses, which have grown in popularity through efforts by companies such as Coursera, edX, or Udacity. And so no classroom time is required under the Wisconsin program except for clinical or practicum work for certain degrees. And that means really to open up higher education as a kind of new branch in the economy and on the knowledge economy, because I think that Coursera, edX, and Udacity will not be the only one that really try also to give the credentials or to try to get as a private company, private corporate, also the right to hand over diploma and to sign diploma. That could be really a revolution in this academic context. When you look a little bit about features of inclusion and exclusion, we have always the same terms. It's about access. It's about affordability of certain technologies or certain elements. It's about confidence and trust, about privacy and about disclosure and so on, about the relevance in a certain context, about skills, and about support. And in 2008, there was a report by the European Commission that is done by this guy, as I just mentioned, Christine Redeker, on learning 2.0, and if there might be major changes to expect in higher education and so on. And here at least the barriers that they showed up. So there is the burden being really went through a lot of reports and research studies, and so the different people of the academic context, the learners on the one hand, and the teachers on the other hand, and of course the institutions itself. And you see that actually, for example, basic digital skills, really to how to handle a word processor or something like that. Special needs, especially for students that think that they might get disadvantage the technology will not fit their integrate technologies in the because of course there will be new roads, there will be new practices, control elements will lead change. Highly this element, that arguments that have been brought up by the different studies by people. And we know a little bit are their pathways. So first of all, I want to 40 minutes I'm nearby gone. I think that this is, for example, an interesting model. We use it very often to explain what's going on because it's about interactions in pedagogical settings. It has been published by Leo van Leer in 1996. And transmission, questioning that one is leading the conversation just by asking questions, or and then the students give a given answer, and then evaluation of or it gets transformational and transactional group work, or even here in transformation, that all the guys that are part of this community are really defining themselves what they want to do. What will be the aim of the learning, what will be the topic of the learning, what will be the goals, and so on, how the course will be done. And then, of course, something that is really transformative and really innovative. And you see also, just by doing that, we have this old way that we still have in academia, that we have in higher education, the transmission idea is really broken up. Other terms that are quite interesting. There's exploratory learning, self-determined learning. Relationship in learning, process-oriented, where there's a lot of definition and a lot of interpretation possible. So that's very interesting when we say that we put really our academic activities for the students at the periphery, where there's more interaction, where there's more collaboration. And again, I think that here tools such as Web 2.0 tools are really encouraging this kind of process. Another model that is quite interesting is says that regarding this development of Web 2.0 tools on collaboration, on creativity, and on information sharing, that efficient learning today, or Web 2.0 learning, is a lot about connection. Interactive with a lot of media, a lot of modalities with your partner, and try to share your content with the guys that are around. And then you see that really the a lot of connections and a lot of interactions are involved. When we look a little bit on this bringing technology to the higher education context, we see that there are kind of conflicting dimensions. On the one hand, this technology is also, as Professor Leblanc showed it this morning, a lot of possibilities for personal learning development, learning environments. So a lot of personalization, I guess, with the Web 3.0, this personalization will even get stronger. There are self-directed, self-selected, I would even say, learning strategies, learning resources. On the other hand, there's also this kind of collaborative dimension. How can we find a balance between on the shaped resources on the one hand, and on the collaboration idea on the other hand? That's one of the dilemmas where we have to find possibilities and possibilities for higher education. The blended strategies that have also been mentioned by Professor Leblanc this morning. But how can we bring this distance and this proximity together so that we can define and manage educational trends that are quite complex and quite demanding also for higher education institutions? The reliability, as soon as you open up to social web and to the user content, user-created content, the best example is things such as Wikipedia with all discussions. Is this reliable knowledge that we see there? Or is this reliable information? So as soon as there's not only one guy who is selecting the the professor, of course, the resources of a certain academic activity. So how reliable are the other information that students bring in? So, and then the control of data, the copyright, and all these intellectual property rights that bring us also to the legal element of this Web 2.0 practices. And of course, when we do not provide it on our own, services or technology-oriented research group, there will be external providers that also will create other legal problems as well, and the problem of control and of preservation of the data, and at the end, whom do the data belong to? Who is the owner of the data? So that is, all these kinds of, I think, are increasing uncertainty. So that, with this technology, with this use of Web 2.0 tools, we increase uncertainty. And that's exactly where we want to go. It's about rich roads, so that we really try, everything should be predictable, and then our, as I say, is learning in higher education ritualized performance. Or on the other hand, is it more about situational, responsive, observable, project-based, and then it gets, of course, more uncertainty and more involved. So then the question is, how much uncertainty avoidance is possible in a certain field, in a certain area, in a certain country, because there are cultural studies that show that this uncertainty avoidance is not the same in all the countries all over the Europe. So I want to conclude with two slides. The first one is about how can we design instructional scenarios that are on the one hand quite challenging, and on the other hand also not frightening for the learner. So that's why I Prof on the one hand the challenge dimension, from low to high challenge, and on the other hand the support that you provide for the learner to do this. Is it a low support or is it a high support? So of course, when the challenge is low and when the support is low, that's extreme, that's a boredom zone where really no one is really interested to stay and to do quite an active work in this kind of scenario. When the challenge is very low and the high support, then everyone feels comfortable. So there's no really an effort needed to come to the expected and to the wanted outcomes or expected outcomes in a certain field. I think this is the most terrific area where there's a lot of frustration, a lot of anxiety. So there are high standards, high challenges, and there's low support, and this might be the zone where the most of the people drop out of a context, of a learning context. And the interesting one is, of course, when there's a high challenge, and there's also kind of supportive environment that is really encouraging the students, encouraging the learners to stay and to really to face the challenges, so that we have a kind of learning and we have a kind of engagement and in the same report where we had of Rebecca and her colleagues, they speak about learning, about assessing, about networking, about social, about diversity, and all about. I will not go into detail, but I just refer to that. What I find just interesting is when you focus on these 5 dimensions that they say that it's not only about pedagogical innovation or technological innovation, but really about also organizational innovation and development. And that's something that we have always to keep in mind, that there's also this organizational element that has to be taken into consideration when there should be any innovation on the pedagogical side as well as the technology side, because we see that there might be new ways of creating a kind of new culture and empowering, of course, the learner to this thing. So the last one is about another model where we can say when you implement new technology, you have to change the practices. Another thing that we have is already used, or it's an augmentation of something, might a little bit a step further. But when it gets really serious, I think that we have to transform higher education, and then, of course, also some procedures and hierarchies have to be challenged that we always take for granted. All this knowledge management, how knowledge is accessed, but also assessed, has to be taken into consideration. And maybe that the rethinking, that the learning outcomes that I have shown through this 21st century skill model might be also quite relevant with this kind of thing. And as our first speaker this morning started with Aristotle, I want to close with another philosophical quote done by Marshall McLuhan, one of these great media series. And he said, we can no longer build serially, block by block, step by step, because instant communication ensures that all factors of the environment, so of the space and the time, of the environment and of experience coexist in a state of active interplay. So, thank you for your attention.